So good morning, everybody. Thank you all for turning up on a Friday morning at the end of August. I'm pretty impressed, but it's an indication of the importance of this topic, and this is going to boom across at people. So thank you all for making the time to do this on a Friday morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today and to help chair the discussion afterwards. Let me give you a little bit of context. At the Center for Global Security Research, we set out an analytic agenda built around 5 big problems, one of which is Russia and European security and deterrence. And in the course of getting started in this area this summer, we've convened a workshop with partners together in the United Kingdom in June, and then a discussion in Washington last week with about 50 partners from across the interagency and think tank community. Both of those events focused on the question of 2 questions, really. How do we understand Russia's strategy for deterring us? Not Russian capabilities, which is what we spend a lot of time looking at, but their strategy. What are the organizing concepts? What are the problems they're trying to create for us so that we would choose not to defend a stake or an interest when they press it? And the second question then is, well, what's our counter? Not what are our countering capabilities, what's our strategy for countering their strategy? And what's been conspicuous to me so far is that there isn't much new thinking on both of these questions in the United States. And we're going to help fill that gap at the Center in partnership with some others. But there is new thinking on both of those questions in Europe, or at least in parts of Europe. As you could imagine, in the anxious parts of Europe. The parts of Europe that feel pressured. Many parts don't. To pick on the Portuguese for no obvious reason, for Portugal, it's hard today to imagine that an attack on one is an attack on all in Europe. But for our Central European and Northern European allies and a couple of neighboring states who are not allied, Finland and Sweden, there's a lot of anxiety about how to strengthen the deterrence posture of the alliance, which means adapting the deterrence posture to a different set of requirements than it's been tailored for so far. And there is very good thinking among generally a younger generation of analysts in Europe on this question. And one of this good pieces of work came my way about 3 weeks ago, and it was Jacek's paper that we highlighted in the invitation. I've worked the NATO nuclear portfolio. I had the NATO nuclear portfolio when I was in the Pentagon. I've been directly connected to NATO's nuclear discussion for the last 6 years. It's been a big discussion, by the way, just well out of the public limelight. And this is absolutely the best piece of work there is on this topic. Jacek has set out both an understanding of the problem and an understanding of the solution space. And when I sent him a note in congratulations, he said, well, I'm actually just down the road in Monterey. I'm not sitting in Warsaw. So we cooked up this plan for a Friday morning discussion. He is a member of the research staff at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, which goes by the Polish acronym PISM, P-I-S-M, somewhere on that slide, I think. PISM is an independent think tank, but it's essentially sponsored by, affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it provides analysis and research and recommendations to different elements of the Polish government, but in a manner that tries to raise the level of public and international discussion about security issues in Europe. There are approximately 40 analysts at this center. It's got a long and distinguished history. I first became aware of Jacek's work early in my tenure in the Pentagon when we were trying to remake the European ballistic missile defense approach. And there was a lot of, there was very little writing in the US community on missile defense in Europe. And there was some in Europe, and again, the best piece of work that came my way was written by this young lad who was otherwise unknown to me at that point. He's published directly on areas of interest to our center, on arms control issues, what to do about the INF Treaty now that Russia's in non-compliance with it, what to do about ballistic missile defense in light of the Iran deal. This has a big implication for NATO's debate about missile defense. He was directly involved in work of his institute in thinking through transparency and confidence building measures on non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. What can we reasonably accomplish with the Russians and others today, if not also in the longer term? He is a pre-doctoral student working on a dissertation on alliances and extended deterrence. That's what brought him to Monterey to work with David Yost. David is a distinguished professor of national security studies at the Naval Postgraduate School and also has a distinguished record of publication, particularly on US nuclear relationships with allies and extended deterrence and assurance from a cross-regional perspective, Europe and Asia. And he's written also very thoughtfully on the requirements of strategic stability, both from a Cold War perspective and in the contemporary perspective. David will offer a few comments following Jacek's presentation, and then we'll open up the discussion for Q&A. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jacek Durkalec.
Thank you, Brad, and I'm thankful for inviting me here. So I have never dreamed that I will come at one point to one of the nuclear labs in the US. So it's really a great pleasure. And after such a great introduction by Brad, you know, the bar of expectation is quite high. So hopefully I will do my best just to present my thinking and views on this issue. So today I would like to present the main conclusions of my report, which was published in July, and actually I started to working on it in 2014, and it's supposed to be a, let's say, an 8-page policy paper, but then, you know, the new information were coming each day, and at one point I decided that I just need to publish it because then I will probably never do it. I'm glad that it was published and it received such positive feedback by Brad, which is always priceless. Okay, so let me start my presentation, and you can see that the picture which is behind me. So it's a photo which I took in Moscow in March 2013, if I remember. So I think I don't know about any other country when you can see posters of nuclear weapons around the streets, but it shows somehow the Russian approach to nuclear weapons. So in today's presentation, I will cover 3 points. First, I will point out why is it reasonable to infer that during the Ukraine crisis, Russia has been sending nuclear messages to NATO, which adds a nuclear significance to the crisis. Second, I will present challenges to NATO's nuclear deterrence and assurance, which were exposed by the Ukraine crisis. And third, I will briefly discuss different options of NATO's nuclear update. Let me begin with explaining why, because of Russia's behavior, the Ukraine crisis has had a nuclear significance. And it is not straightforward. the judgment that nuclear weapons have played a significant role during the Ukraine crisis is still, I think, a minority view. Many in the United States and in Europe still insist that the Ukraine crisis has no nuclear significance and it is not a nuclear crisis. In my view, the Ukraine crisis could be even regarded as a nuclear crisis because it is reasonable to infer that Russia has been deliberately trying to use its nuclear weapons to influence Western positions during the conflict, particularly NATO member states. Russia's activities in and around Ukraine have been accompanied by unprecedented dissemination of nuclear-related messages. So first, don't mess with nuclear-armed Russia statements, which were repeated at the highest political level in Russia. Second, provocative bomber flights near the airspace of NATO and partners. Third, nuclear-related exercises, including surprise drills, which encompass delivery vehicles for strategic but also non-strategic nuclear weapons. So I will not go into, say, specific examples about different Russia's activities, as it would take perhaps a couple of hours, and if you may see them in my report when I tried to provide examples of them which are available in open sources in press. The question is, however, why should Russia's behavior be seen as something exceptional and tailored to the Ukraine crisis? So all of Russia's activities have, I think, left a room for some more or less possible deniability. Also, we have all been used to Russia's nuclear boasts. So even before the Ukraine crisis, there were a number of examples of Russia's provocative behavior, including, for example, mocked nuclear attack on Sweden in 2013. I think that first and foremost, the context matters. Russia's nuclear-related activities have been taken place against the backdrop of Russia's aggressive actions against Ukraine, and during the crisis, even routine military behavior translates into a signal. But what I'd like to stress, it is not only about a context. It is significant that Russia has gone far beyond its usual, normal routine. The number and frequency of nuclear-related deeds and words originated from Moscow have alone been disturbing. So being a bit Hegelian, I would say that quantity has changed into quality. Moreover, the scale, complexity, and provocative nature of some activities were unprecedented in the post-Cold War period. For example, in terms of bomber flights, Russia has seemed to make an effort to ensure that the messages were not overlooked by others. So the flights have been longer, their patterns differed from those in the past, their complexity has increased, with greater numbers of heavy bombers flying with more diverse groups of aircraft. The specific timing has also been important. Russia's activities have often coincided with critical periods of the ongoing crisis and decisive moments aimed at responding to Russia's behavior. For example, the NATO Wales summit, Ukrainian President Poroshenko visit to the United States, or the EU deliberations about further sanctions against Russia. Last but not least, Russia's activities seem to have gone beyond actual Russia's military readiness. So I think that the recent crashes of two Russian strategic bombers somehow indicate that with its hyperactivity, Russia has overstretched its nuclear forces. Also, the need for nuclear messaging seemed to have prevailed over long-standing Russia political stance. Boasts about Russia's missile capabilities contradicted claims that US missile defense poses a threat to Russia's strategic deterrent. The question is then why Russia resorted to nuclear messaging. First, to make it clear, sending a nuclear message doesn't necessarily mean that Russia is planning to employ nuclear weapons against NATO member states. I think it's more rational to think that Russia employs in practice Thomas Schelling's concept of competition and risk-taking. It tries to manipulate risk in its own benefit, and Russia take advantage of its, or exploits its comparative advantage of being seen as a revisionist power which is able and ready to take a risk. And Russia sends nuclear messages because it assumes that it would never have to translate them into real actions because others would just back off. With its nuclear posturing, Russia most likely has intended to send a message to NATO member states. It is likely that an implicit threat of nuclear escalation has been used to minimize even very remote possibility that NATO members would even think about direct engagement in Ukraine. Also, Russia might use nuclear signal as a tool to decrease the costs of its aggressive actions. So Russia might attempt to discourage the West from imposing harsher and stricter economic sanctions, perhaps decrease the scope of NATO's conventional presence in conventional weapons presence in Central and Eastern Europe, or dissuade Western states from providing some lethal military aid to Ukraine. I think that Russia's nuclear messaging might be a warning that such Western actions would lead to a comeback or return to a Cold War-style nuclear standoff in Europe, and this is something that no one in Europe wants. Possible nuclear deployments to Crimea seem to play a role of the, let's say, ultimate marking of the new Russia's territory. And among other reasons, domestic audience could be also a factor. However, I'm unconvinced that solely the need for assuring the public or military-industrial complex would push Russia so far with its actions during the crisis. While Russia's nuclear saber-rattling has had an influence on the Ukraine crisis by defining its limits, it is hard to assess with certainty its real impact. So it's difficult to say to what extent Russia's actions have been effective. The bottom line is, however, that Moscow conduct shows that Russia is willing to use its arsenal as a tool of coercion. So Russia's nuclear weapons doesn't play only a traditional deterrent role, and because during the Ukraine crisis, Russia has been using nuclear weapons to support the status quo. So nuclear arsenal has provided Russia cover for conventional and unconventional actions against Ukraine. So nuclear weapons have been used to back up Little Green Man and other actions on the ground in Ukraine. And I think that from Central and Eastern European perspective, that Russia's nuclear posturing has strengthened anxiety that any hypothetical crisis between NATO and Russia would involve some Russia's nuclear messaging, implicit or explicit. Now, I will turn to my second point, about NATO's restrained response and its shortcomings. Russia's nuclear-related actions sparked a response from NATO member states. The response was very restrained, and I think that NATO allies rightly avoided engaging in tit-for-tat with Russia. And the allies mostly stuck to their nuclear routine. However, there were some non-routine forms of NATO allies' response. So they may included the Polish participation in the annual NATO Steadfast Noon exercises, and also what was even more visible, the United States with some NATO allies conducted several strategic bombers flight to Europe during the crisis. Still, despite these responses by NATO members, I think that Ukraine crisis has exposed many challenges to the effectiveness of NATO's nuclear policy. The Ukraine crisis was accompanied with recurring doubts about the credibility of NATO's nuclear deterrence, and the doubts were expressed not only by experts, but also by high-ranking NATO's military officers. Nextly, there have been signs of public doubts about NATO's current nuclear arrangements. So it was visible in calls for geographic and qualitative changes in NATO's nuclear posture, particularly involving Poland. The crisis also raised concerns about NATO's nuclear crisis management toolbox. So whether NATO leaders would be able to respond effectively if there is a real, say, NATO-Russia clash. NATO's public communication on Russia's belligerence was, in my view, belated. NATO allies, including the United States, have become more outspoken about the nuclear dimensions of many Russia's activities, including bomber flights in February, March 2015. So a one-year gap in terms of when the crisis began. Last but not least, the Ukraine crisis has revealed a risk that NATO is unprepared or unwilling to send collective nuclear messages. So the initiative in the messaging was taken by the United States, who acting bilaterally or in larger coalitions of the willing, conducted a number of nuclear bombers flights in Europe. So the bomber flights exercises were not collective NATO messages agreed by consensus by all, by the allies. And I think that the crisis has shown a risk of fragmentation of NATO's nuclear policy, a situation in which the NATO allies would prefer to send implicit nuclear messaging through the United States rather than by a consensus of the alliance as a whole. And such fragmentation decreases the value of nuclear messaging and raises questions about the credibility of NATO's collective deterrent and the resolve of all allies to face nuclear risks. Let us now turn to my third and last point, which is about implications of the Ukraine crisis for NATO's nuclear deterrence. Taking into account the exposed gaps, I think that NATO's nuclear policy needs an update. And also the framework of public discussion on NATO's nuclear adaptation should change. It's not about doing nothing or undertaking the unnecessary steps. There are a lot of options other than solely a conventional response to Russia's actions and more nuclear weapons in Europe closer to Russia. And presenting this only two alternatives is a false choice. If you look at the options which I recommend in my paper, they are all in the middle between these two extremes, and they are all about upgrading NATO's nuclear software, not about going beyond keeping the B-61 and the dual-capable aircraft up to date. While designing these options, I have tried to make all of them consistent with dual NATO goal of maintaining effective deterrence while seeking the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. Still, I'm fully aware that NATO's nuclear adaptations for different reasons would not be an easy task. One of the reasons is that the Ukraine crisis exposed many gaps in terms of NATO's preparation to possible, let's say, scenarios involving Russia, so including hybrid warfare and some conventional contingencies. And nuclear adaptation would not be political priority for any NATO member states in the nearest term. Because of this wide-ranging adaptation needs, I doubt that the serious debate updating the NATO 2012 deterrence and defense posture review, whether it can take before the Warsaw Summit in July 2016, but still I think that the summit could be a launching point for such a discussion. Going to my options. The first one is rebalancing thinking to nuclear deterrence. This option is about changing of collective NATO mindset, something which seems impossible. However, I think that the allies should demonstrate that their top priority, given the new nuclear landscape in Europe, if it is really new, is to deter a nuclear crisis involving Russia, not preparing for further nuclear reductions. It is, however, a rebalance, so it doesn't mean that NATO should abandon the goal of seeking conditions toward world free of nuclear weapons, including through arms control measures. Indeed, arms control is even more important with Russia as an adversary than Russia as a partner. Second option is that NATO should re-examine its nuclear crisis management tools. So the main task of NATO nuclear policy is of course to prevent any crisis from happening, but crisis happens. They are not fully preventable. And And because of that, NATO should improve its intelligence and analytical skills to strengthen its own capability to interpret Russia's nuclear messages and to design the proper responses to Russia's actions. Third, NATO should adjust its exercise practice. So the alliance should start by publicly acknowledging the existing regular nuclear exercises, which I mentioned in my report. I think it doesn't look quite serious that NATO's code names of NATO's nuclear exercises are included in NATO job announcement, but they are not acknowledged publicly by high-level NATO officials. And I think that NATO can be transparent without disclosing any sensitive information about such exercises. And to show the non-aggressive nature of what NATO is doing, the alliance could juxtapose its own exercises with Russia's exercises. Then the message will be quite clear that it is something different. And I think that going public with NATO's exercises would be in line with the pre-Ukraine crisis efforts to increase transparency and with regards to non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. Also, nuclear scenarios could be injected in NATO's tabletop crisis management exercises just to strengthen the ability of NATO leaders to effectively act during the crisis. And furthermore, NATO members could decide to prepare in advance non-routine forms of collective nuclear messaging, and which could be used if the circumstances require them. Such new forms of messaging could include joint exercises with US strategic bombers. I think it would reduce the risk of fragmentation of NATO nuclear policy, and in the future, such exercises might, of course, not necessarily lead to reassessments of the role of dual-capable aircraft in changing different circumstances. Fourth, NATO should refresh its declaratory policy. Particularly, NATO allies should create and publicize a commonly agreed narrative on the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons for the alliance, because I think that credibility of overall NATO's nuclear deterrence is negatively affected by a perception of a lack of consensus on the purpose of non-strategic nuclear weapons and the alleged inability of dual-capable aircraft to reach the targets if needed. Last but not least, NATO should redesign its nuclear communication strategy. So it should return to the practice of regularly communicating to the public and outside world its thinking on nuclear matters. And for example, NATO could come back to the practice of issuing public communiques after the nuclear planning group meetings. The last such communique was in 2007. NATO should inform the public about the most provocative forms of Russian behavior and explain why specific Russian actions are regarded as such. And progress has been made in this area. So there is a picture of NATO Secretary General's speech at CSIS in May 2015, which was very good and provided more information about what Russia has been doing. And I think that transparency about NATO's own activities could strengthen the alliance credibility in denouncing Russia's steps, because it would provide a point of reference. And without being clear about the sharp differences between NATO activities and Russia's steps, there is a risk that public would become more and more vulnerable to Russia's efforts to make even routine NATO's or US activities appear equivalent to what Russia has been doing or even worse. And the recent NPT conference, I think, is a notable example of shortcomings in NATO's strategic communications. So many nations sought to put pressure on NATO to continue to disarm, to change its nuclear policy, and in the same time, very little attention was paid to the increased role of nuclear weapons in Russia's defense policy and war planning, or Russia's dangerous nuclear messaging. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you. And
is that good? Okay. Jacek Durkalec has presented a valuable summary of a remarkable paper that deserves close and careful reading. My role is to raise a few questions to launch our discussion. In doing so, I am speaking for myself alone, not for the Naval Postgraduate School, not for the Navy or the Department of Defense. I propose to raise three questions. First, about Russia and nuclear deterrence. Second, about Russia and nuclear operations. And third, a broader political question about cooperation with Russia. Jacek has given us an excellent foundation for thinking about the first question, Russia and nuclear deterrence. As his analysis suggests, the Russians have demonstrated that nuclear weapons are not simply instruments supporting a defensive and peace-preserving approach to deterrence in international politics. The Russians have shown that nuclear weapons can be used to support a strategy of aggression and belligerence and coercion. With regard to Russia's intervention in Ukraine, the Kremlin is using nuclear threats to warn the NATO allies to be cautious about lending support to Kiev lest they cross one of Russia's red lines. To repeat, the Russians want to deter NATO countries from providing much support to Ukraine. This is having an effect on the NATO allies, with clear divisions on questions such as the future of economic sanctions and whether to provide lethal military assistance to Ukraine. As Jacek has pointed out, the most important question here is what should the United States and its NATO allies do about Russia's coercive approach to nuclear weapons and deterrence? The second question concerns Russia and nuclear operations. In other words, it concerns what might happen in the event of a crisis leading to combat. This topic is not only about what might happen after a failure of deterrence. Thinking about that contingency and pondering how to deal with it may shape the prospects for effective deterrence, war prevention, and crisis management. To what extent do Russian concepts of nuclear operations differ from those of the NATO allies? During much of the Cold War, particularly after the adoption of MC-14/3 in 1967, the Strategy of Flexible Response, the NATO concept of nuclear operations was, and I quote that document, if the aggressor remains intent on his purpose, to confront him with such resistance that he will be compelled to withdraw or risk further escalation, which, if necessary, would include the controlled use of nuclear weapons. The Allies agreed that, as an authoritative RAND study put it in 1983, follow-on use should have the same purpose as initial use, to persuade the enemy to cease his aggression and withdraw. And the nature of the use should therefore still be selective and be designed to meet this political requirement. According to the Alliance's 1991 strategic concept, I quote, "The forces of the Allies must be able to defend Alliance frontiers, to stop an aggressor's advance as far forward as possible, to maintain or restore the territorial integrity of allied nations, and to terminate war rapidly by making an aggressor reconsider his decision, cease his attack, and withdraw." The NATO allies appear to have retained this concept for the conduct of nuclear operations, even though they have repeatedly declared that they regard a contingency involving the actual operational employment of nuclear weapons as extremely remote. This was the phrase used in the 1999 and 2010 strategic concepts. Without going into further detail, the point is that NATO's published statements and public comments by informed experts suggest that the alliance's concept of nuclear operations, if the conflict reached that stage, would involve limited and highly selective use in order to convince the adversary to cease his aggression and withdraw. At first glance, this sounds comparable to the Russian concept of using nuclear weapons for de-escalation, discussed in Russian sources since the late 1990s. There is a significant difference in political objectives, however. The alliance's concept has been and remains defensive. For the alliance, the objective in the case of nuclear operations would be to restore the security and integrity of the NATO area. In contrast, Russia's concept of de-escalation has evidently been designed to employ nuclear weapons for advantageous battle termination. To escalate out of losing a conventional military engagement on Russia's periphery, to stop the fighting, and to keep the ground acquired. Moreover, a number of studies of Russian doctrine and exercises suggest that the Russians are increasingly prepared to take a warfighting approach to nuclear operations, with accurate and very low-yield weapons with tailored effects that might be employed to neutralize enemy command posts, airfields, ports, and other facilities and capabilities. In other words, there may be a sharp contrast between Russian and NATO assumptions and expectations about nuclear weapons operations and escalation control. NATO seems to assume that limited and selective use would bring about an end to combat with the restoration of the security and integrity of the NATO area. In contrast, the Russians may be preparing for a more extensive use of nuclear weapons to support the achievement of political and military goals, including the acquisition of territory. The question here is, how should the Allies understand Russia's approach to nuclear operations? And as Jacek has suggested, how should NATO respond to it? NATO seems to assume that limited and selective use would bring about an end to combat with the restoration of the security and integrity of the NATO area. In contrast, the Russians may be preparing for a more extensive use of nuclear weapons to support the achievement of political and military goals, including the acquisition of territory. The question here is, how should the Allies understand Russia's approach to nuclear operations, and how should NATO respond to it? For the alliance's deterrence and defense policy to be well-founded, the Allies have to think about possible operations, nuclear and non-nuclear. Third, and finally, what framework for cooperation with Russia has any chance of success? Through its actions since 2007, Russia has repeatedly demonstrated its rejection of NATO's vision of cooperative security. The year 2007 is often cited because of Putin's speech in Munich, Russia's resumption of Cold War-style strategic bomber patrols, Moscow's suspension of compliance with the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and the cyber attacks in Estonia. The NATO allies have, since the end of the Cold War, advocated the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. The Russians have accepted some of the NATO language about cooperative security, notably in the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997 and in the NATO-Russia New Quality Statement in 2002. In their own declarations and in practice, however, the Russians have never endorsed the NATO argument that the enlargement of the alliance contributes to Russia's own security by stabilizing states that would have otherwise pursued national defense policies at odds with each other and with Russia. Russia's own concept for European security, the draft European Security Treaty published in 2009, would subordinate NATO to consensus decisions by a larger body involving states as well as organizations such as the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. The NATO allies have reached out to Russia with the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, Partnership for Peace, the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and the NATO-Russia Council, and with an array of cooperative activities. But this effort has not been enough to satisfy Russia. Why not? Part of the answer may reside in political dynamics within Russia, a preference on the part of the regime for confrontation with the West to help to legitimize the regime. Another part of the answer may be Russia's zero-sum mentality about interactions with foreign states, something the European Union has repeatedly discovered. What other factors should be taken into account? This deserves more investigation. Russia's behavior has made clear the urgency of more studies and analyses about this country and its nuclear and military policies, a priority that has been neglected in the United States and most other NATO countries for a quarter of a century, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Thank you.